What secrets were so dangerous that the CIA and KGB tried to erase them from history? How did a tunnel under Berlin collapse into betrayal before it even began? Was it a coincidence that a scientist fell from a hotel window after a mind control experiment? And what happens when walls don't just divide cities, but families? Tonight, you'll step inside the Cold War's most guarded files and hear the whispers they never wanted you to catch. You crouch in the dim glow of a cigarette lighter beneath the dusty floorboards of East Berlin, surrounded by whispers, sweat, and a suspiciously large number of bored British engineers. Somewhere above your head, Russian typewriters clatter like mechanical woodpeckers, signals being intercepted, secrets being shared. And down here, you're part of the most audacious peeping Tom project the Cold War has ever seen. Welcome to Operation Gold, aka the Berlin Tunnel, also known as the molehill that became a mountain of embarrassment. Let's be honest, digging a 1,500-foot tunnel under a Soviet-controlled city wasn't the most discreet of hobbies, but the CIA, ever the overachievers with shovels and a vengeance, partnered with MI6 to tap Soviet military lines, and for a brief, shining moment, it worked. The Soviets, blissfully unaware, or pretending to be, continued transmitting everything from weather reports to nuclear protocols. Every time a colonel coughed into the mic, somewhere in Langley a junior analyst perked up like it was Morse code. But here's the kicker. The KGB knew about it from the start, thanks to George Blake, the British double agent who, with the stoicism of a bored librarian, handed over the whole plot before the first shovel struck soil. Historians still argue whether the Soviets held back on dismantling the tunnel immediately to protect Blake's identity, or because they found it mildly amusing to feed the CIA red herrings while sipping vodka. The Americans, unaware they were being played, celebrated the mission like a kid who thinks he's winning hide and seek because no one's found him in the obvious spot behind the curtain, never mind the feet sticking out. And oh, how they listened. They gathered crates of tapes, notebooks of transcriptions, and enough static noise to start a museum of Cold War white noise. It's hard to say which was more embarrassing, realizing the KGB had known all along, or admitting you spent millions to eavesdrop on Soviet gossip about meat rations and troop socks. And yet this operation set the stage for how spycraft would be conducted for decades. Grand in ambition, fragile in secrecy, and somehow always undone by that one guy at the office who can't keep his mouth shut. Still, the tunnel was a feat of engineering, a little miracle of concrete and copper beneath a city straining at its seams. And for a while it symbolized that weird Cold War paradox, both sides acting like omniscient puppeteers, while fumbling like drunk magicians behind the curtain. And when the Soviets finally discovered the tunnel in 1956, cue dramatic shock, they held a press conference. They accused the Americans of being naughty and untrustworthy, as if Stalin himself hadn't already greenlit half of Eastern Europe's bugging devices. The tunnel was paraded like a smoking gun, conveniently forgetting it had been a known prop in their private stage for years. So there you are, crouched in that tunnel, breathing in cement, dust and irony. You think you're part of history's greatest secret, but the secret's on you. And even now, decades later, your eavesdropping legacy lives on in fiber optics and targeted ads. But back then, it was all wiretaps, switchboards and betrayal, laced with asbestos. And just when you think this absurd little tunnel could be the high point of clandestine Cold War engineering, you remember what's happening just a few blocks away, where people scale walls, disappear through back doors, and spy on spies, spying on spies. And so you step back into the light of divided Berlin, where betrayal isn't an accident, it's protocol. You step into the cold glare of Checkpoint Charlie, blinking against the floodlights like a mouse scurrying across a chessboard where the pieces shoot back. Welcome to divided Berlin, where the streets hum with tension and even the pigeons look like informants. East and West, split like a bitter divorce, held together only by the shared custody of suspicion. And if you're standing here, you're already suspect. In this fractured city, Espionage isn't a dirty secret. It's a civic duty. The CIA and KGB treat Berlin not as a battleground, but as a theatre, and everyone's auditioning whether they know it or not. The cab driver quoting Brecht a little too precisely, spy. The florist who sells only one kind of flower, but asks detailed questions about your relatives in Minsk, spy. Your landlady who accidentally enters your apartment when you're gone, spy with a very passive-aggressive taste in furniture arrangement. And this isn't just paranoia, it's logistics. The city was a spy buffet. West Berlin was a glittering island of capitalism floating inside the dour seas of East Germany, and everyone wanted a piece. The KGB ran deep networks here, embedding agents not just in embassies, but in bakeries, schools, and jazz clubs, because nothing says intelligence work like a smoky saxophone solo and a discreet conversation about NATO troop movements. But the CIA wasn't far behind. They set up safe houses, tapped phone lines, and recruited East German defectors, like a deranged HR department with a taste for trench coats. Each agency was obsessed not only with what the other was doing, but with who among their own might be leaking, because betrayal wasn't just inevitable, it was fashionable. One of the most tragicomic examples, the saga of Gunther Guillaume, an East German spy who infiltrated the office of West German Chancellor Willy Brandt. Not only did he rise through the political ranks, but he became a trusted aide until his exposure led to Brandt's resignation. Historians still argue whether this was a masterstroke by the Stasi or a case study in bureaucratic myopia. Either way, the man brewed coffee for the Chancellor while reporting to East Berlin. That's Cold War multitasking at its finest. Meanwhile, the Berlin Wall itself wasn't just a barrier. It was a symbol, a recruitment tool, and a storytelling device. Western agencies used it to galvanize public opinion and gather intel from escapees. Eastern agencies used it to keep people in, sure, but also to test how far someone might go to get out. There were tunnels, hot air balloons, zip lines made of laundry cord, and even one man who crossed by tightrope. Yes, really, it wasn't just escape, it was performance art. And beneath this circus of cement and subterfuge, psychological warfare pulsed like an electric current. The KGB deployed active measures, rumors, forgeries, staged events to undermine Western morale. The CIA countered with its own bag of narrative tricks, pamphlets dropped like deadly snowflakes, false broadcasts, and even attempts to create a cool version of capitalism that didn't look like a Pepsi commercial had exploded in your living room. Still, the human cost was staggering. Families were split by the war, lovers separated by ideology, children growing up on different sides of a line that ran through hearts more than it did through streets. And you, walking through this frozen time capsule in 1960s Berlin, are aware of it all. The wires under the floor, the bugs in the lamps, the looks that linger a little too long in crowded train stations. What makes it all more surreal is the fact that everyone knows. This isn't secret warfare, it's just unacknowledged. A wink, a nod, a knowing glance over the top of your newspaper. This is Cold War Berlin, where the lies are truth, the truth is classified, and every coffee shop might be bugged unless it's the barista herself doing the bugging. But even here, in this pressure cooker of suspicion, something stirs, whispers of deeper projects, louder ambitions, operations no longer content with simply listening or watching, because Berlin was just the rehearsal space. The world, that's the main stage, and the scripts being written next are bolder, bloodier, and far more absurd than any Shakespearean tragedy could dare. That silence, it won't last. You're not entirely sure when the news anchors started sounding like CIA assets, but by the time you finish your lukewarm 1960s coffee and flip through your government-funded newspaper, it's obvious someone, somewhere, is writing the headlines with a very specific agenda. And it's not just to sell toothpaste. This is Operation Mockingbird. The CIA's delightful little foray into mass media manipulation. Because why just influence governments when you can program the dreams of an entire population? It begins innocently enough, just a few friendly informal relationships with journalists, a whisper here, a planted quote there. But soon the CIA has over 400 journalists on the payroll. That's not an influence network, that's a full-blown newsroom. Suddenly, newsrooms from the New York Times to Time magazine are echo chambers, repeating variations of the same idea. Freedom is American-shaped, and everything else smells suspiciously like communism. And yes, the Cold War was ideological, but that didn't mean it wasn't also theatrical. The CIA understood early on that stories, not bullets, win the long game. Why overthrow a regime when you can convince the citizens it needed toppling? Why argue in public when you can quietly script both sides of the debate? Enter the press agents, stringers, ghostwriters, a surprising number of war correspondents in Latin America, Africa, and Asia were writing double columns, one for the public, one for Langley. The agency even invested in film studios. You think Hollywood was immune? Guess again. The freedom versus tyranny trope wasn't just popular, it was subsidized. Think of every war drama where the Americans are flawed but fundamentally noble, and ask yourself, whose red pen made that edit? But don't worry, the Soviets were doing it too. The KGB's media arm was less subtle, but just as prolific. They didn't infiltrate Time magazine. They created entire fake magazines, fake letters to the editor, fake scandals. One of their proudest hits, the rumor that the CIA invented AIDS. Seriously, that particular piece of disinformation ran so far and so wide, it's still echoing through internet forums, like a bad DJ loop. And here's the kicker. Most of this was legal, or at least unlegislated. There were no rules about how many journalists you could own, how many TV scripts you could tweak, how many front groups you could create. It wasn't until the 1970s Church Committee that someone finally said, hey, maybe using our democracy like a puppet show is bad optics. But by then the damage was done. The lines between information and persuasion had blurred beyond recognition. When every article could be a covert operation, and every opinion piece a whispered directive, trust became the first casualty. And to this day, historians still debate, how deep did it go? Was every headline an opera, or just the important ones? Was this national security, or national gaslighting? One fringe tidbit that never made the headlines. The CIA also funded literary magazines, yes, really, highbrow journals, that published existential poetry while quietly nudging intellectuals toward the correct worldview. It's espionage by metaphor, which is arguably even more dangerous than espionage by wiretap. After all, who suspects a haiku? And then there's you. You read the news, you nod at the editorial, you talk politics with friends, all while unknowingly quoting the subtle drip feed of a psychological operation. You thought you had opinions. Turns out you were a delivery system. This is the Cold War's other battlefield. Not forests or deserts, but dinner tables and campus debates. The front lines ran through newspapers, novels, films, and minds, and in that foggy, seductive realm of half-truths and implied narratives, reality becomes a flexible thing, a tool, a weapon. Because in this war, controlling the facts was never the end game. Controlling belief was. And as you ponder that eerie silence between the evening headlines and the national anthem, you can't help but wonder, if they controlled the media, what else did they touch? That question, it doesn't go away. You're sipping a cheap drink in a smoky bar somewhere in Vienna when the door creaks open and in walks your new best friend, a charming refugee with perfect American idioms, an encyclopedic knowledge of Soviet troop movements, and a resume that screams, should have been tried at Nuremberg. Welcome to Operation Bloodstone, the CIA's ethically flexible solution to post-war manpower shortages. Because apparently nothing says freedom like recycling ex-Nazis into Cold War assets. Let's be blunt, after World War II, the intelligence community looked around and thought, Well, communism's the new villain, and hey, these guys really hate communism. The these guys, in this case, were former Nazis, fascists, and ultra-nationalist anti-communists scattered across Europe like angry puzzle pieces. Some had fled eastward, others were imprisoned, many simply went underground. All of them had one useful thing in common: a grudge. And what do you do with angry men holding maps of Eastern Europe, and a willingness to kill? If you're the CIA, you build a program. Operation Bloodstone wasn't just a one-off. It was a recruitment pipeline. The logic was perverse, but efficient. If the Soviets were recruiting ideologues, the Americans would recruit executioners. Historians still argue whether this was pure desperation, political pragmatism, or ideological hypocrisy wrapped in bureaucratic memo paper, but the results are not disputed. Bloodstone agents were slipped into Eastern Bloc countries to spread disinformation, sabotage infrastructure, and recruit underground cells. Some disappeared forever, others sent back reports, usually smuggled in hollowed-out boots or diplomatic pouches full of forged documents and a generous sense of dramatic flair. But the moral cost, that was less discussed. You see, some of these men weren't just former Nazis, they were recent war criminals. Think SS officers with a fresh coat of cologne and a slightly amended backstory, exfiltrated through Italy via Vatican channels or laundered through South America. They emerged reborn, friendly émigrés with a surprising tolerance for classified documents and cyanide pills. The Soviets, for their part, screamed bloody murder. They called out these recruitments at the UN, published exposés, even staged fake trials to emphasize the West's hypocrisy. Of course, the KGB had their own version of Bloodstone, former Nazis who defected to their side, double agents, and ideological turncoats. The Cold War was, after all, a festival of moral relativism. There's a fringe theory that one of these Bloodstone operatives accidentally caused a blackout in Budapest by sabotaging the wrong generator. Another story suggests one infiltrated the Hungarian secret police and lasted 5 years before being caught, only to vanish during a suspiciously timed prison riot. These aren't just war stories. They're the foggy snapshots of a war where the lines were so blurred no one's entirely sure who won any given battle. And as the operation expanded, it morphed. Bloodstone agents didn't just go into Eastern Europe. They slipped into Latin America, Southeast Asia, and even parts of Africa. Their job: stir unrest, whisper counter-revolution, remind local leaders that democracy came with tanks and translators. Some ended up in military juntas, others became professors. A few wrote memoirs with suspiciously polished English. So here you are, clinking glasses with a man who once goose-stepped through Warsaw, now handing you microfilm like it's a dinner mint. You smile, unsure whether to feel grateful or nauseous. He tells you about the great threat of communism, with fervor, with purpose, and you believe him. Because his hatred is real, because his past is real, and because in this upside-down war, old sins are scrubbed clean by new loyalties. The truth: it's messy. Intelligence work always is. You don't win wars with saints, you win them with survivors. And if your allies happen to have blood on their hands, well, at least it's not red. But something's still wrong in the air. You can feel it, like a whisper from the past, asking if you really want to know what that man did before he learned to say freedom in perfect Midwestern English. You wake up in a sleepy village in Belgium to find that beneath the cobblestone charm and flower boxes, there's an armory buried in the cellar, a radio transmitter under the church pew, and a man named Uncle Marco, who makes killer pastries and keeps a list of communists taped behind his spice rack. Welcome to Operation Gladio, where NATO, the CIA, and a network of anti-communist militias prepared for a Soviet invasion that, awkwardly, never came. Let's rewind. It's the late 1940s, and Western Europe is twitchy. The Iron Curtain's snapping shut. Eastern Europe is firmly in Stalin's grip, and Italy looks like it might vote its way into Marxism. Enter the CIA and its European cousins, who decide that if the Reds ever roll their tanks into Paris or Rome, they'll need to be greeted by something a little more forceful than strongly worded pamphlets. So they set up stay-behind armies, secret cells of trained fighters, arms caches, and emergency communication systems sprinkled throughout the countryside like paranoid Easter eggs. Officially, these groups were dormant, insurance policies just in case. Unofficially, many were extremely awake, extremely political, and extremely unregulated. The CIA loved it. It was the kind of operation that blended long-term strategy with plausible deniability. Guns in haylofts, safe houses in vineyards, forged passports next to grandmother's rosary. If the Soviets ever crossed the Rhine, these partisans would rise up like caffeinated ghosts. And if they didn't, well, the temptation to use these assets for local political meddling became too great to resist. Take Italy, for example. The Italian Communist Party was gaining traction at the ballot box, and that made Washington very nervous. So the Gladio network, along with Italy's own intelligence services, allegedly helped fund centre-right candidates, intimidate leftist organisers, and occasionally, how to put this, make sure accidents happened. Train derailments, bombings, unexplained disappearances. No official links, of course, just rumours, just shadows. Historians still argue whether Gladio's members were behind the infamous Bologna train station bombing of 1980, which killed 85 people and wounded over 200. Some say it was far-right terrorists. Others whisper of manipulated patsies and false flags. What's known is that Gladio agents existed, were trained by NATO, and were often handed a blank check in exchange for stability. France had its own Gladio units. So did Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Greece, and even Turkey. In some places, they remained discreet. In others, not so much. There were reports of Gladio operatives training with knives in alpine monasteries, storing explosives under schoolhouses, and maintaining lists of undesirables to be rounded up if the communists ever took over. Lists that, disturbingly, included union leaders, journalists, and sometimes just people with the wrong moustache. And who was watching all of this? Nobody, really. These were black-budget operations, buried under layers of bureaucracy and need-to-know silence. When Gladio was finally exposed in the early 1990s, long after the Soviet threat had evaporated, most governments simply shrugged. Italy admitted it. Belgium held hearings. The CIA naturally had no comment. The most surreal detail. Some of these operatives had no idea who they were really working for. They were told they were patriots, defenders of democracy, guardians of Western civilization. They were never told their orders came from Langley, routed through NATO offices, and filtered by a very select club of men in tailored suits and iron smiles. And you, sipping espresso in a Roman cafe, start to realize that freedom in Cold War Europe wasn't a light switch, it was a knife edge. There were no clean sides, just people with guns waiting for orders that thankfully never came, and sometimes orders that came a little too early. Gladio's legacy lingers like smoke in a sealed room. It's the reason some people flinch at the word stability, or wonder aloud whether their grandparents' town really needed that many underground bunkers. And as the Cold War marched on, Gladio's blueprint, preemptive control through covert militias, would echo far beyond Europe. But that's a shadow you'll meet in Latin America. For now, in this quiet village under NATO's watchful eye, you learn a curious Cold War truth. Sometimes the side preparing to resist tyranny ends up tasting a bit tyrannical themselves. And that line between defense and domination, it's starting to wobble. You blink against the sun in Leopoldville, where French suits, Belgian waffles, and Congolese machetes somehow coexist in a post-colonial fever dream. It's 1960, and the Congo has just won its independence. Well, sort of, because while the Belgian flags come down, the CIA briefcases go up, and across the street, the KGB is already renting rooms and polishing its French Africa, once carved by empires, is now a playground for Cold War puppeteers. Let's get specific. The CIA had what one might politely call a panic reflex to African independence, especially when those new governments dared to flirt with neutrality, or worse, lean even a smidge toward the Soviets. So when Congolese Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba made anti-colonial speeches and hinted that maybe he didn't want American mining companies calling the shots anymore, the US didn't send a fruit basket. They sent Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA's real-life Bond villain chemist, to poison his toothpaste. Yes, really. Meanwhile, Moscow heard the same speeches and thought, finally someone with backbone, and immediately offered Lumumba support, advisors, and possibly the worst gift bag ever, ideological baggage wrapped in Marxist wrapping paper. Historians still argue whether Lumumba was truly a Soviet puppet, an opportunist, or just a guy trying to keep his country from being strip-mined into oblivion. What's clear is that the CIA, with Belgian help and a lot of plausible deniability, backed a coup to remove him. He was arrested, transferred, beaten, and eventually executed. His body was dissolved in acid. His teeth, literally, were kept as souvenirs. Welcome to geopolitics, kids. The Congo quickly spiraled into civil war, a proxy conflict in everything but name. Western mercenaries parachuted in like it was a Bond film with a very confusing script. The Soviets sent advisors to help anti-Western factions who weren't always ideologically pure, but were reliably anti-American, which was enough. And as chaos reigned, the mining companies, both Soviet and American-backed, kept digging. But Congo wasn't an outlier. It was the model. Angola, same playbook. The MPLA had Soviet backing, so the CIA poured resources into UNITA, training guerrillas, shipping arms, and occasionally misplacing them into the hands of local warlords, who used them less for freedom and more for, well, machete diplomacy. Mozambique, Rwanda, Ghana. In each case, independence brought hope, then advisors, then weapons, then confusion. And through it all, both CIA and KGB treated African nations not as sovereign players, but as chess pieces, disposable, replaceable. Talk too much about socialism, you're out. Get too cozy with Exxon, you're in. Flip sides mid-speech, welcome to the jungle, literally. One fringe tidbit that didn't make many history books. The CIA once considered using psychics to remotely influence African leaders during UN votes. You heard that right. Remote influencing via psychic waves. Apparently someone thought the best way to fight communism in Ghana was through telepathy. Spoiler, it did not work. Meanwhile, the KGB had its own strange tactics, like supplying fake anthropological studies designed to suggest local traditions were naturally socialist. They literally tried to argue that Marxism was indigenous to the Zambezi River Valley. Creative, yes. Convincing, not even slightly. And through all of it, the people of these nations were often left bewildered, betrayed, or buried. Revolutions consumed their own children. Dictators sprouted with the frequency of mold in a monsoon. And always behind the curtain, two old men, one with a CIA badge, one with a KGB pin, arguing over whose ideology should fund the next death squad. Africa became a continent of ghost wars. Conflicts that technically didn't exist, fought by soldiers who didn't wear uniforms, funded by budgets that didn't appear on spreadsheets, and you, standing in the middle of it, begin to realize something chilling. In the Cold War, the superpowers rarely fought each other directly, not out of mercy but out of convenience. Why kill your rival when you can just kill his friends? And as a convoy rumbles past filled with teenage boys, clutching mismatched rifles, wearing American boots and Soviet scarves, you wonder, whose side are they on? And worse, do they even know? But that's a question for someone else. For now, the radio crackles with reports of a coup attempt in Ghana, and you suddenly remember you've got a meeting at the embassy, and a file labelled Operation Safari is waiting for you. That file, by the way, it's not going to end well. You're sipping watered-down coffee in a hotel lobby in Santiago, pretending not to notice the man 2 tables over who keeps accidentally photographing the ashtray. You've learnt the routine by now: bland conversation, double talk, and the subtle glances of intelligence officers pretending to be tourists. But the stakes here are very real. It's 1973 and Chile, and someone's about to be pushed out of power, literally from a palace window. And guess what? Both the CIA and KGB have front row seats. Latin America was never neutral ground. It was a test kitchen for covert action, a geopolitical petri dish where the CIA perfected regime change like it was a barbecue recipe. Guatemala in 1954, the test run. Chile in the 70s, the full-course meal. Let's start with Guatemala. President Jacobo Arbenz tried to redistribute land, much of it owned by the United Fruit Company, a friendly little capitalist banana empire with close ties to Washington. That word redistribute sent shivers down the Potomac. Suddenly Arbenz was a communist sympathizer, and the CIA launched Operation PB Success. A name that sounds like a motivational poster, but in reality meant bombings, psychological warfare, and a lovely little coup that threw Guatemala into decades of civil war. Historians still argue whether Arbenz was truly red, pink, or just stubborn. The important thing is he lost, and the world took notice. Which brings us to Chile, where Salvador Allende had the audacity to be elected democratically while being a Marxist. You see the problem? The Nixon administration certainly did. Kissinger famously said, "I don't see why we need to stand by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people. You know, democracy." So the CIA got to work: propaganda campaigns, funding opposition parties, economic sabotage, declassified documents read like an evil choose-your-own-adventure. And in 1973, with U.S. encouragement, General Augusto Pinochet launched a coup. Planes bombed the presidential palace. Allende, defiant to the end, gave his last speech over the radio and was dead hours later. The official story: suicide. The whispered version: less tidy. Pinochet's regime was brutal. Disappearances, torture, mass executions. And guess who helped set up the intelligence apparatus that enabled that? Yep, the CIA. Ever helpful, offered training, technology and support. Not that they signed the death warrants, but let's just say they provided the office supplies. Meanwhile, the KGB wasn't idle. They supported leftist movements across the region. In Nicaragua, in El Salvador, even whispering sweet nothings to Peruvian generals, flirting with nationalization. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it exploded. Literally. In every country touched by these shadows, the same pattern played out. Student activists disappeared. Priests were shot. Whole villages vanished overnight. And the manuals, torture manuals, interrogation guides, counter-insurgency playbooks, were printed in English and Russian, shipped in diplomatic pouches, and buried under layers of deniability. There's a lesser-known tale from Argentina, where a CIA-funded security seminar somehow turned into a death squad recruitment drive. Or Bolivia, where Che Guevara was hunted down with the help of US advisors, executed in the jungle, and turned into a martyr before the blood was even dry. And through it all, both sides claimed to be protecting freedom. For the CIA, it meant Coca-Cola democracy with occasional military rule. For the KGB, it meant revolution, but only if it painted the hammer and sickle in flattering light. You, watching it unfold, wonder what sovereignty means when your army's rifles come with a side of diplomatic immunity. In Guatemala, they called it La Decena Trágica. In Chile, it was just El Golpe. In Argentina, La Guerra Sucia. Different names, same ghosts. And here's the cruel irony. Many of the regimes the CIA propped up eventually turned on them. Authoritarianism, it seems, isn't great at brand loyalty. So you light another cigarette, because what else can you do? Latin America once rich with revolutionary dreams and political possibility, is now a graveyard of ideals, and somewhere in a DC office, someone's typing a memo about the successes of foreign policy, while in Moscow a KGB analyst files another report marked "Moderate Impact, Heavy Backlash." The blood, that's on both typewriters. And just when you think this hemisphere has seen enough, the Cold War looks to the Caribbean, and the next show, it's going to be explosive. You stand on a rusting pier in Havana, watching the sea whisper conspiracies toward Florida. The sun is blinding, the rum is cheap, and behind the palm trees, someone is probably aiming a camera at your back. Welcome to Cuba, where the CIA and KGB turned an island into a Cold War chessboard and then set the board on fire for fun. Let's start with the failed magic trick, known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. In 1961, the CIA, ever confident, trained a ragtag group of Cuban exiles to storm the beaches, rally the oppressed, and topple Fidel Castro in a patriotic avalanche. Spoiler, it didn't go well. Castro's forces crushed the invasion in about 72 hours. The exiles were captured, humiliated, and paraded through Havana like a cautionary tale. And the CIA, they spent the next decade trying to erase that embarrassment with increasingly cartoonish schemes. Operation Mongoose, the revenge sequel, began almost immediately. Think Wile E. Coyote, but with a black budget. Plans included poisoned cigars, exploding seashells, chemically induced beard loss, and even a plan to dose Castro with LSD during a live broadcast so he'd start babbling nonsense. Historians still argue whether these ideas came from trained operatives or a brainstorming session inside a frat house. Meanwhile, Castro, who found all of this hilarious, tightened his alliance with the Soviet Union. Khrushchev, ever the opportunist, decided to park a few medium-range nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Miami. You've probably heard of the Cuban Missile Crisis. What you might not know is that while the world teetered on the edge of nuclear annihilation, both the CIA and KGB were furiously trying to outbluff each other like two drunks playing poker with matches. Behind the scenes, intelligence officers were intercepting cables, bribing informants, and panicking quietly. Soviet submarines circled the Caribbean. American U-2 planes soared over Cuban skies. And in the middle of it all, a quiet, terrifying standoff. For 13 days in October 1962, the world held its breath, and for once neither side wanted to win. They just wanted to not lose everything. After Khrushchev blinked and agreed to remove the missiles, in exchange for a very hush-hush promise that the US would remove theirs from Turkey, everyone claimed victory. Privately, the CIA fumed, the KGB smirked, and Castro, he was furious at both. But the games didn't stop. Cuba became a hotbed of counterintelligence and overlapping plots. The CIA tried everything to turn insiders. They failed. The KGB installed one of its top agents, Alexander Kuznetsov, to oversee operations in Havana. He succeeded in turning the island into a Soviet listening post, complete with a massive SIGINT facility in Lords, one of the USSR's most prized ears on the Americas. And then there's the fringe detail that reads like a spy novel gone wrong. CIA officers using coded messages through baseball games. If the announcer says curveball, it's a go. Yes, really. It would be funny if it weren't true, or maybe because it is. As the 1970s rolled in, the CIA realized Cuba wasn't just a problem, it was a symbol. Every failed operation became a lesson in overreach. Every new scheme became a parody of the last. Even the mafia got involved, with the CIA recruiting mobsters to take out Castro in exchange for regaining control of Havana's casinos. Naturally, it failed. Castro, annoyingly immune to bullets and irony, kept giving speeches and smoking cigars, like a man who knew his enemies were incompetent. Meanwhile, the KGB wasn't resting on its laurels. Cuba became a training ground for revolutionary movements, across Latin America and Africa. Troops, advisors, weapons, they all flowed through Havana with Soviet blessing. Angola, Ethiopia, Nicaragua, they all bore Cuban fingerprints. You, flipping through declassified documents decades later, can't help but marvel at the absurdity. An island of sugar and salsa became the eye of a storm, one that danced between farce and catastrophe with alarming grace. The Cold War was never colder than in Havana's humid streets, and through it all, the people of Cuba watched, waited, and suffered. Blockades starved them, propaganda flooded them, their island became a stage, and the actors never left. Even now, whispers of those days echo through peeling colonial buildings and empty supermarket shelves. And if you ask the right old man at the right cafe, he might tell you about the time he saw a briefcase change hands under the Malecon, and how the ocean seemed to pause just for a moment. But he won't tell you everything, because some secrets still belong to the sea. You're ankle deep in rice paddies, swatting mosquitoes the size of Cold War lies, and wondering what on earth you're doing in Vietnam, a place where ancient dynasties once ruled, and now CIA field agents and KGB operatives trade bullets and bribes like it's a weekend flea market. The war here isn't just about jungles and napalm. It's about perception, allegiance, and whispers in the shadows. And those whispers, they're often American or Russian. From the start, Vietnam was misread by both superpowers. The US saw it as a falling domino, the USSR a chessboard to disrupt Western ambitions. Both decided, with their usual delicacy, to turn it into a proving ground for ideologies neither side fully understood. Let's be clear, the Vietnam War wasn't just a military conflict. It was an intelligence orgy. CIA psyops, KGB infiltration, and every flavor of betrayal in between. On the American side, the CIA was involved before the first Marine boot touched Vietnamese soil. They trained South Vietnamese operatives, launched paramilitary raids, and ran something called the Phoenix Program, which aimed to neutralize Viet Cong infrastructure. In practice, that meant torture, blacklists, and enough ethical gray zones to repaint the Pentagon. Historians still debate whether the Phoenix Program actually disrupted the Viet Cong or just created a steady flow of new recruits, with very personal vendettas. What's not debated is that over 20,000 people were neutralized, and many of them weren't even sure what they were being accused of. Meanwhile, the KGB played the long game. They embedded advisors with the North Vietnamese, helped with code breaking, and funneled weapons and propaganda through a dizzying network of Soviet bloc intermediaries. They knew the Americans were good at firepower, but the Soviets, they were playing culture chess. In Hanoi, Soviet agents trained political cadres in counterintelligence. They established lines of communication with other anti-colonial movements, and made sure that any whiff of independent Marxism was gently nudged back into Moscow's orbit. North Vietnam may have seemed autonomous, but many decisions were shaped by quiet, vodka-scented meetings in dimly lit basements. There's a lesser-known episode where KGB agents intercepted CIA radio transmissions meant for hill tribes in Laos. The Americans were trying to recruit the Hmong people with promises of protection and aid. The Soviets countered with psychological operations, including forged broadcasts and creepy nighttime propaganda played over hidden loudspeakers. Nothing says join our cause like ghostly communist lullabies echoing through the jungle. And then there were the double agents. Oh, so many double agents. South Vietnamese generals on the CIA payroll, who were secretly feeding info to the North. North Vietnamese soldiers flipped by the Americans, only to double back and sow disinformation. Even US soldiers were sometimes approached by Soviet journalists asking innocent questions with rather precise implications. One bizarre incident involved a CIA operative losing a briefcase full of forged North Vietnamese documents. Days later, those same documents were quoted in a Soviet newspaper, just slightly altered to frame the Americans as colonial invaders. Fringe, yes, effective, Also yes. And through it all, Vietnam bled, not just from bombs and bullets, but from the relentless tug-of-war of competing truths. Each side funded newspapers, radio stations, puppet NGOs. The goal wasn't just to kill, it was to control the narrative. Was the South a fragile democracy or a puppet dictatorship? Was the North liberating or enslaving? It depended on who you asked, and whether they'd been paid. You, trudging through the muck, can't help but notice how surreal it all is. The war is supposedly about freedom, but every village seems to fear both the Viet Cong and the government. Every schoolteacher is suspected of being a spy. Every American leaflet dropped from helicopters seems to contradict the last. Reality fractures under the weight of too many agendas. And when Saigon finally falls in 1975, the US flees in helicopters, while Soviet advisors toast in Hanoi. But neither side really won, because Vietnam wasn't a victory. It was a cautionary tale, a jungle so tangled, not even ideology could cut through. Later, in Langley and Lubyanka, analysts pore over reports, trying to understand what happened. The KGB congratulates itself for strategic patience. The CIA blames local corruption. Both miss the point. Because Vietnam didn't break under pressure, it drowned in secrets. And just as the embers fade, new fires spark elsewhere. Fires the CIA and KGB are already fueling, this time in the mountains of Afghanistan. And the game begins again. You're standing at the edge of the Hindu Kush Mountains, staring into a landscape so ancient it makes politics seem like a recent glitch. The sun rises over jagged peaks, the wind whispers through poppy fields, and down in the valleys, CIA operatives are handing rocket launchers to men in sandals. Welcome to Afghanistan, the last great proxy war of the Cold War, a place where strategy met hubris, and both decided to ride donkeys into battle. It's the 1980s, and the Soviet Union has done something spectacularly stupid, invaded Afghanistan. Their plan, prop up a communist government and squash Islamist insurgents. Simple, except they've apparently never read a history book. No one conquers Afghanistan, not the British, not Alexander the Great, not even Mongols, with momentum. Enter the CIA, smelling opportunity, the way wolves smell weakness. Operation Cyclone is born, a covert mission to arm, train and bankroll the Afghan Mujahideen. The logic is classic Cold War. If the Soviets want a quagmire, let's help them sink. At first it's subtle. Weapons trickle in, advisors arrive, wearing sunglasses and plausible deniability. The funding's modest. But as the war drags on, Congress starts writing bigger checks, and Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence ISI becomes the middleman. Soon CIA officers are helping funnel billions in arms, including the now iconic Stinger missiles that turn Soviet helicopters into metal confetti. Historians still debate whether the CIA truly understood who it was funding. Some of these Mujahideen were moderate nationalists. Others, a bit more fire and brimstone, figures like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who shelled Kabul later in the 90s, got rich off US generosity. But hey, they hated the Soviets, that was enough. Meanwhile, the KGB isn't idle. Soviet special forces, Spetsnaz, conduct brutal raids, assassinations, and counter-insurgency ops. They attempt to prop up puppet regimes with charm offensives, literacy campaigns, and the occasional mass execution. It doesn't work. The Mujahideen use terrain like a second skin. Every mountain is a fortress. Every village elder is a spy. Every child might be a scout. And while the CIA arms rebels, they also build a narrative. Hollywood joins the fight. Rambo III features Stallone aiding Mujahideen, described as freedom fighters. American school textbooks even teach Afghan kids how to count, using illustrations of tanks and grenades. Yes, really, that's how deep the propaganda ran. The war drags on. Soviet soldiers die by the thousands. Morale collapses. Coffins pile up back in Moscow. And just when it can't get worse, Charlie Wilson, a Texas congressman with a flair for bourbon and backroom deals, pushes for a massive funding increase. Operation Cyclone goes nuclear in the metaphorical sense. But here's the twist. The CIA never really controlled who got the weapons. The ISI had its own agenda. They favored hardline Islamist factions, sidelined moderates, and built a Frankenstein's army, stitched together by ideology and ambition. Some of these fighters would later become the Taliban. Others would join Al-Qaeda. But that was tomorrow's nightmare. For now, it was all high fives and victory speeches. In 1989, the Soviets retreated, humiliated. Afghanistan was hailed as the USSR's Vietnam. In Langley, the champagne popped. Mission accomplished, right? Not quite, because the CIA, in typical Cold War fashion, left right after the Soviets did. No post-war rebuilding, no institution building, just a vacuum. Into that vacuum rushed warlords, extremists, and chaos. The same men once handed stingers became kings of ruin, and Afghanistan. It bled and burned for decades more. One fringe tidbit that's rarely discussed. During Operation Cyclone, there were reports, never confirmed, that some mujahideen received basic satellite training and tactical maps that showed Soviet military positions across Central Asia. In other words, they weren't just resisting, they were learning. The KGB, licking its wounds, internalized the lesson hard. Never again would they underestimate asymmetrical warfare. And years later, when Russia invaded Chechnya, they brought that bitter memory with them, this time with far less mercy. And you, crouching in a mountain pass with the wind howling through your jacket, realize what the Cold War truly became in its final phase, a global puppet show with broken strings and puppets that started pulling back. Afghanistan was supposed to be the Soviets' graveyard. It ended up being everyone's. And far away, as the USSR begins to crumble, the CIA and KGB stare at each other across a new battlefield, the shattered illusions of their own victories. That silence, it's starting to break. You're in a quiet suburb of New Jersey, sipping gas station coffee and watching a man named Jack mow his lawn with suspicious precision. His kids go to Catholic school. He volunteers on weekends. He's just a little too ordinary. That's because Jack, whose real name is Andre, is a KGB sleeper agent. He's been here for decades, and until recently, even he wasn't quite sure where his loyalty lived anymore. Welcome to the world of deep cover Soviet spies in the United States. Silent infiltrators who blended in so well, they became their covers. While the CIA was playing checkers with banana republics, the KGB was quietly setting up its long game, embedding agents in American society like time-release capsules of treachery. One of the most famous was Jack Barsky, aka Albrecht Dietrich, a German-born KGB agent who lived undetected in the US for over a decade. He had a social security number, a job in IT, and a fondness for suburban normalcy. His mission? Observe, report, and eventually something more. What? Even he wasn't entirely sure. That's the thing about illegals, KGB parlance for deep cover spies. They were often activated only when needed. Until then, they were just American. Barsky eventually abandoned his mission, seduced not by capitalism, but by Little League games and peanut butter. But for every Barsky who turned soft, there were others who stayed loyal. The KGB's Directorate S specialized in these illegals. No embassies, no diplomatic immunity, just years of language training, identity theft, and meticulous backstories involving fake childhoods in Cleveland. Historians still debate how many were actually in place. Some say a few dozen, others claim hundreds. One fringe theory suggests there was an entire KGB network embedded in the US postal system, which, if true, explains a lot about lost packages in the 1980s. The FBI, for its part, struggled. It wasn't easy to detect someone who didn't act like a spy. No dead drops, no encoded messages, just a guy who loved barbecue and occasionally made suspicious late-night calls to Europe. And when they did catch someone, the charges were murky. Espionage without action doesn't exactly roll off a judge's tongue. Meanwhile, the CIA tried their own version of this, but let's be honest, Americans don't blend in as well. A man with a buzz cut, mirrored sunglasses, and a fondness for quoting Reagan doesn't exactly scream undercover. And while they had successes, the KGB's patience often outclassed Langley's impulsiveness. Case in point, the Illegals program, exposed in 2010, yes, long after the Cold War, revealed that sleeper agents had remained active under false identities for years. One couple, the Murphys, lived in Montclair, New Jersey, raised kids, hosted barbecues, and passed encrypted messages through Wi-Fi bursts and digital steganography. It was espionage wrapped in IKEA furniture. And yet, despite all this planning, these deep cover agents rarely caused major damage. Why? Because America is chaotic. The flow of information is tidal. Even spies get lost in the noise. But their existence, the mere idea that your neighbor might be an agent, was powerful. It seeded paranoia, doubt, the kind of fear that no missile ever could. One quirky anecdote? At one point, a KGB sleeper was told to observe local opinion on US foreign policy by hanging out in bowling alleys and listening. Imagine spending years learning flawless English just to eavesdrop on drunk guys debating Ronald Reagan between frames. But even if most illegals didn't steal top secrets, they served another purpose, proving that Soviet intelligence could beat America at its own game, not through violence, through patience, through the slow, unsettling realization that the guy making your cappuccino might speak fluent Russian and report to a man named Boris twice a month. And you, walking your dog through a leafy street in 1980s America, start to feel it. The shift, the awareness. The Cold War isn't just a distant chess match. It's right here, in the grocery line, in the PTA meeting, in the quiet tap-tap of a typewriter behind drawn curtains. This war isn't fought with armies. It's fought with assumptions. And as the sun sets over this peaceful neighborhood, you wonder if the KGB could be here all along. Where else are they? And that question, it's about to dig deeper. You're in a fluorescent-lit lab somewhere near Langley, surrounded by files that smell like old paranoia and regret. The man across from you, calm, grey-haired, clinically precise, slides a folder toward you labeled MK Ultra. You open it, and for a moment you wonder if you've stumbled into a sci-fi convention or a crime scene, because what's inside reads like dystopian horror, and every page is stamped top secret. Operation MK Ultra. It sounds like a comic book villain, but it was real. A CIA program so bizarre, it still sparks conspiracy theories today, most of which, disturbingly, aren't exaggerated. Starting in the early 1950s, the CIA, fueled by Cold War anxiety and a curious obsession with mind control, began experimenting on human subjects. The goal? To control behavior, to erase memories, to create, possibly, a Manchurian candidate, just in case democracy needed extra protection. It all started with the fear that the Soviets and Chinese had already cracked the code. After the Korean War, US POWs returned with suspiciously pro-communist statements. Were they brainwashed? The Pentagon panicked, the CIA panicked harder, and thus began a secret race to weaponize the human mind. What followed was a cocktail of cruelty and curiosity. LSD was tested on unwitting participants, including CIA officers, soldiers, prisoners, and everyday civilians. Some were drugged without consent. Others volunteered without knowing the full scope. Psychologists were brought in to measure obedience. Hypnosis sessions were conducted to test memory erasure. Electroshock therapy was used not to treat, but to break. Historians still argue whether MK Ultra had a coherent goal, or was simply a sandbox for sadistic ambition. What's known is that over 80 institutions, including universities and hospitals, were involved, often without being told the CIA was behind the research. Grants were laundered through fake foundations. Files were scattered like breadcrumbs in a forest of plausible deniability. And then there were the fringe stories, ones that sound fake, until you realize this was the CIA in the 1950s and 60s, when oversight was just a polite cough. One subject was given LSD every day for 77 days straight. Another was kept in sensory deprivation while being pumped with barbiturates and amphetamines. There's even evidence of attempts to use psychic powers, yes, actual government interest in remote viewing, telepathy, and psychotronic influence. But the most infamous case, Dr. Frank Olson, a CIA biochemist who, after being dosed with LSD without his knowledge, began to unravel. 9 days later, he fell or was pushed from a New York hotel window. The CIA called it suicide. His family wasn't convinced. Decades later, a second autopsy suggested he'd been struck before falling. Was he a liability, a loose end, or just another casualty of an agency that had become drunk on its own secrets? The program continued in secret until the early 1970s, when the Watergate scandal triggered a broader investigation into intelligence abuses. In 1975, the Church Committee hearings pulled the curtain back slightly, and America blinked. Suddenly, the idea that your government might experiment on your brain wasn't conspiracy, it was history. And when Congress asked the CIA for records, most of them had already been destroyed, ordered incinerated by then-director Richard Helms in 1973, a move that speaks volumes in the silent language of bureaucratic guilt. The KGB, of course, got wind of all this. They didn't respond with shock. They responded with glee, because the CIA had handed them a propaganda gift, proof that the land of the free had been quietly trying to puppeteer its own citizens. And so, in carefully curated broadcasts, the Soviet Union warned its people of America's dark science. Pot, kettle, irony. You, sitting in that dim lab, realize MK Ultra wasn't just a bad idea. It was a symptom of a deeper disease that infected both sides of the Cold War. The belief that fear justified anything. And the real horror, no one was ever truly held accountable. No trials, no convictions, just whispers and shattered minds. As you walk out, the air feels heavier, like something unseen has lingered too long, and you begin to wonder if this is what they admitted to. What haven't they? And in that silence, another program waits. Different name, same ghost. You're standing in a bookstore in Prague, browsing titles that smell of damp paper and dissidence. The man next to you slips a slim volume into his coat, not for shoplifting, but for survival. The book is banned, its ideas illegal, its author exiled or imprisoned, and somewhere someone is photocopying it, by candlelight for the 50th time. Welcome to the world of samizdat, underground literature, and ideological warfare, not with guns, but with metaphors. This is cultural espionage, the quieter front of the Cold War. And while the CIA had rockets and briefcases, it also had printing presses. Propaganda wasn't just about leaflets dropped from planes. It was about shaping taste, opinion, emotion, because hearts and minds aren't one with facts, they're one with stories. One of the CIA's most ambitious efforts in this arena was the Congress for Cultural Freedom, CCF, a supposedly independent organization that from 1950 to the late 60s funded writers, magazines, and art exhibitions, all under the table, of course. The idea, show the intellectual world that you didn't have to choose between conformity and communism. There was a third way, jazz, Sartre, and novels, where people smoked and questioned everything. CCF published over 24 magazines worldwide, like Encounter, Der Monat, and Prove, often edited by respected academics and writers who in many cases had no idea who was really signing the checks. They paid well, published smartly, and positioned Western liberalism as not just a political stance, but a lifestyle. You know, martinis, Camus, and curated despair. Historians still argue whether the writers involved were naive, complicit, or just too flattered to ask questions. The scandal broke in 1967 when Ramparts magazine revealed that the CIA had been quietly pulling the strings. The literary world exploded. Some resigned in outrage, others shrugged. One editor quipped, "Better the CIA than the KGB." And speaking of the KGB, they were busy too. Their brand of cultural influence was louder, more top-down. Writers were censored, jailed, or nudged into compliance. Books were vetted, plays were rewritten, typewriters were registered with the state. It wasn't just Big Brother, it was Big Editor. But they also funded sympathetic writers abroad. The Soviet Union subsidized publishing houses in Europe, Africa, and Asia. They sponsored film festivals, jazz tours, yes, even jazz, and art exhibitions that subtly whispered, "The West is decadent, capitalism is hollow, and our revolution has better lighting." Then there were the defections, writers, musicians, dancers, fleeing east to west or west to east, depending on who had the better grant money that year. Each side turned these artists into trophies, proof that freedom or collectivism produced better novels, ballets, and existential dread. One quirky example. The CIA secretly funded the publication of Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago after the Soviets banned it for its counter-revolutionary spirit. They printed small, attractive copies and smuggled them into the USSR. The goal wasn't mass literacy, it was prestige. They wanted Soviets to see that their own culture could thrive more freely in the hands of their ideological enemies. Pasternak won the Nobel Prize. Moscow was livid, mission accomplished. Another oddity. The CIA once helped sponsor abstract expressionist art, Pollock, Rothko, de Kooning, not because they loved drips and swirls, but because it showed that Western artists had freedom. The Soviets preferred social realism, heroic workers and gleaming factories. So the CIA leaned hard into chaotic canvases. Nothing screams democracy like a canvas you don't understand. But for every painting, poem, or novel that slipped through the cracks, there was a response. The KGB infiltrated dissident circles. They turned writers into informants. They published fake memoirs meant to discredit exiles. They whispered in publishing houses, occasionally funding projects with anonymous donations and very specific editorial notes. And you, sitting in that Prague bookstore, start to see it. This war wasn't just fought in deserts and jungles. It was fought on bookshelves, in footnotes, between the lines of a banned sonnet or an experimental film. This was espionage by aesthetics, treason via typewriter. And just when you think the battle is winding down, someone slips a cassette into your hand. It's music, forbidden, raw, perfect. And you realize ideas don't die, they get louder. You're underground, literally beneath Berlin, in a cold, echoing tunnel, just wide enough for a rat or a secret. Above you, a divided city crackles with suspicion. But down here, engineers are sweating bullets while US Army intelligence officers peer nervously at maps. You're standing inside Operation Gold, the CIA's audacious plan to tap into Soviet telephone lines buried beneath East Berlin, because in the Cold War, even dirt could betray you. It was 1954, and the city was already a spy's theme park. East Germans with double identities, Americans with cameras in their cufflinks, British agents who smoked like characters in a Graham Greene novel. The CIA, never one to pass up an overly complex idea, partnered with MI6 to dig a tunnel over 1,400 feet long from the American sector of Berlin into the Soviet-controlled East. The plan: tap into Soviet communications lines and eavesdrop on military and political traffic. It was ambitious, technically brilliant, and stunningly expensive, and doomed from the very beginning. Why? Because George Blake, a high-ranking MI6 officer who helped plan the whole thing, was already a KGB mole. He told the Soviets everything down to the last spadeful of dirt. And yet, in one of the Cold War's most theatrical performances, the KGB let the tunnel be built. Why? So they could control the flow of disinformation and track which Soviet secrets the West thought it had. Historians still argue whether the tunnel was a failure, a trap, or an accidental success. The CIA recorded miles of conversations, some of it real, some of it planted, years of intelligence, some useful, much misleading. It was like trying to learn your neighbor's secrets by listening through a wall they knew was bugged. Then came the discovery. In 1956, after 11 months of carefully choreographed espionage theater, the Soviets found the tunnel. There was outrage, press conferences, propaganda films. The East Germans were furious. The West feigned shock. Everyone played their part beautifully. But Berlin wasn't just tunnels and microphones. It was also the stage for defections, extractions, and standoffs. In 1961, the Berlin Wall went up overnight, a concrete admission that ideological coexistence had failed. Families were split, neighbors became enemies, and spies, they had a field day. Checkpoint Charlie became the world's most photographed tension point. Tanks faced off. Stare contests lasted hours. Behind the scenes, CIA and KGB agents watched from rooftops, radios crackling, waiting for one twitch to start World War III. There's a fringe tale, unconfirmed of course, about a CIA officer who disguised himself as a West German sewer worker, only to emerge from a manhole in the wrong sector. He spent 3 days hiding in an East Berlin bakery's flour sack. Whether true or not, it feels right, because Berlin in the Cold War didn't follow logic, it followed paranoia. Meanwhile, the KGB dug tunnels of their own, not literal ones but psychological. They recruited West Berliners, infiltrated West German intelligence, and set up elaborate dead-drop systems involving fake bricks, hollow trees, and cassette tapes hidden inside Beethoven cases. And the CIA, they trained East German defectors, ran blackmail ops, and allegedly used underground jazz clubs as fronts. Berlin was loud above ground, but below, beneath the music and protests, whispers carried further. One quirk that speaks volumes. In some neighborhoods, telephone poles ran across both sides of the wall. The lines, disconnected, yes, but sometimes, when the wind was just right, voices could still carry. And you, standing at the edge of an old tunnel shaft, decades later, feel it. The breath of the past, still damp and claustrophobic. A war waged not with armies, but with wires and whispers. A war where truth was a rare currency and everyone paid in doubt. Berlin was the Cold War's mirror. Split, distorted, dangerous, and as the decades passed, its tunnels became metaphor. What was hidden? What was known? What was always just out of reach? And now, far to the south, another battleground brews, one with jungles, generals, and a new kind of war, where secrecy wears sunglasses and speaks Spanish. You wake up to humidity thick enough to drink, and the distant hum of helicopters slicing through a Central American sky. Welcome to Nicaragua, 1980s edition, where the jungle rustles with revolution, the air crackles with Reagan-era righteousness, and somewhere in the shadows, the CIA is distributing arms with one hand and plausible deniability with the other, and the KGB, oh, they're watching, grinning, and very much invested. Nicaragua's story starts decades earlier, of course. US-backed dictators, banana republics, Marines sent to stabilize. But in 1979, the Sandinistas, a leftist rebel group, overthrew the Somoza regime, which had long been a Washington darling. Suddenly Nicaragua had a Marxist-leaning government, with real popularity, cool beards, and access to Cuban and Soviet advisors. This did not sit well with the United States, particularly with a newly elected Ronald Reagan, who saw the world in black and red, freedom versus communism, cowboy hats versus hammer and sickle. Enter the Contras, a rebel group made up of former Somoza loyalists, rural anti-Sandinistas, and a smattering of men who were just in it for the boots. The CIA, ever enthusiastic, saw potential. The Reagan administration saw destiny, and the coffers opened. The plan? Simple. Train and arm the Contras to destabilize the Sandinista government. Deny any official involvement. Win back democracy. What followed was one of the most controversial and honestly bizarre covert operations in Cold War history. Officially, the US wasn't funding the Contras. Congress had passed the Boland Amendment, which banned direct aid. But the CIA, like a child caught sneaking cookies, just got creative. They found funds. They traded arms. They used third parties. And in one now infamous twist, they even sold weapons to Iran. Yes, Iran, and used the profits to fund the Contras. Thus was born the Iran-Contra affair, a scandal so convoluted it gave journalists migraines. Historians still debate who knew what. Oliver North, a young National Security Council aide, became the face of the scandal, buttoned up, patriotic and disturbingly calm, while admitting to circumventing US law. Reagan claimed he didn't remember. George H.W. Bush, former CIA director, mostly shrugged, and the CIA, they shredded documents with such enthusiasm you'd think they were in the confetti business. Meanwhile, the KGB watched with popcorn. They didn't need to do much. Every American misstep was a propaganda goldmine. Soviet radio beamed stories of Yankee imperialism across Latin America. Cuban advisors helped train Sandinista forces. And somewhere in Moscow, an intelligence officer likely drew a smiley face next to the phrase US credibility. The actual conflict on the ground was brutal. The Contras, often undisciplined and poorly trained, were accused of atrocities, burning villages, executing civilians, kidnapping children. The Sandinistas, for their part, cracked down on dissent, censored media, and flirted uncomfortably with authoritarianism. The people caught in the middle? Farmers, students, priests. You know, the usual expendables in ideological proxy wars. One lesser known but real detail. The CIA published a guerrilla manual for the Contras that included tips on sabotage, assassination, and psychological warfare. It was like espionage for dummies, except with real consequences. When it was leaked, it caused an international uproar. The CIA called it an oversight. Everyone else called it exactly what it was. And through it all, Nicaragua remained symbolic. To the US, it was the hill on which they would make a stand against communism in their own hemisphere. To the Soviets and their allies, it was proof that the US would do anything to stop even the faintest whiff of socialism. You, standing in the dusty courtyard of a former rebel safehouse, can still feel the tension. The ghosts here don't wear uniforms. They wear ideology. And their legacy isn't in monuments. It's in missing persons and broken families. Eventually, after international pressure, domestic scandal, and years of bloodshed, the conflict simmered down. The Sandinistas agreed to elections. The Contras disbanded. Democracy limped back in. But the damage? It lingered, not just in Nicaragua, but in the very idea of American innocence. The Cold War had many masks. Here, it wore one of freedom, but behind it, just shadows. And now, you feel a shift. Not in the jungles, not in the cities, but inside the Soviet Union itself. Something's cracking. And that sound, it's not a gunshot. It's the beginning of an ending. You're walking through Red Square in 1985, past stern-faced guards and rust-colored buildings that hum with a kind of tired permanence. The Soviet Union is still here, but something's different. The lines are longer, the whispers sharper, and up in the Politburo, Mikhail Gorbachev, young by Kremlin standards and dangerously fond of reform, is poking the bear of Soviet stagnation. The Cold War isn't over, but the ice is beginning to crack. Back in Washington and Langley, the CIA watches with a kind of confused hope. In Moscow, the KGB isn't hopeful. It's furious, because glasnost and perestroika, they sound nice in theory, In practice, they mean losing control. And for the KGB, control is the air they breathe. Let's talk glasnost first, openness. Suddenly, Soviet citizens are allowed to read banned books, talk about government failures, even criticize Stalin cautiously. State-run TV broadcasts debates. Newspapers publish letters from citizens. For an intelligence apparatus built on silence, this is heresy. Then comes perestroika, restructuring. Gorbachev wants to reform the economy, introduce limited market mechanisms, reduce the military budget. In other words, break the Soviet system gently before it collapses on its own. Spoiler, it doesn't work. The KGB, of course, tries to adapt. They rebrand, they shift resources, but they also start hoarding files and blackmailing reformers. Just in case the future goes sour. Historians still debate whether the KGB tried to sabotage Gorbachev's reforms outright, or whether they simply watched him light the fuse and quietly prepared for the fallout. Meanwhile, the CIA is busy trying to figure out if any of this is real. Is Gorbachev a reformer, a sleeper agent of his own system, a genius, a fool? They debate, analyze, and overanalyze. One internal joke at Langley went, "The only thing harder than understanding Russian intentions is understanding Russian logic." But this uncertainty creates space for diplomacy, for spies to become negotiators. Arms control treaties are signed. INF start. Reagan even visits Moscow, shaking hands and giving Gorbachev that Hollywood smile. The world begins to dream just a little that maybe this whole Cold War thing might end without mushroom clouds. And yet the KGB never sleeps. They watch Gorbachev with grim determination. They surveil activists emboldened by glasnost. They monitor the Baltic states, where independence movements are swelling like a rising tide. They know what's coming. The center cannot hold, and when it breaks, they want to be ready. One fringe detail. In the late 80s, the KGB allegedly ran a disinformation campaign to convince the West that Gorbachev was in danger of being overthrown in order to rally support around him and stall more radical reforms. A reverse psychology ploy so convoluted it may only make sense in Moscow. And let's not forget the East German Stasi, basically the KGB's overachieving little cousin. They watched the Soviet reforms with absolute horror. To them, glasnost was a virus. Their solution? Double down. More surveillance, more intimidation, more loyalty tests. Ironically, the Stasi's overreach hastened their downfall. When East Germany finally cracked, the people stormed Stasi headquarters and found endless rows of files, evidence of lives dissected, dreams catalogued, betrayals written in triplicate. Meanwhile, the CIA starts receiving reports from inside the USSR that are almost too good to be true. Economic collapse, military frustration, rising nationalism. They hesitate. After all, they'd missed the fall of the Shah in Iran. They didn't want to miss the end of the USSR, but they also didn't want to believe it was happening. You, standing beneath Lenin's mausoleum, sense the tension. The symbols are still here, the hammer and sickle, the rigid parades, the red banners, but they feel brittle, like painted glass in a windstorm. And just behind it all, the KGB prepares contingency plans for continuity, for suppression, for escape. Because when a system this big begins to crumble, it doesn't go quietly, it howls. And just beyond the Kremlin walls, the people are already beginning to murmur something dangerous. Not glory to the state, but what comes next? You're watching statues fall in slow motion. Lenin topples in Lithuania. Stalin disappears from the Georgian skyline. It's 1989, and Eastern Europe is unraveling like a badly knit scarf. The Iron Curtain isn't just rusting, it's collapsing, fast, under the weight of its own absurdity. And in back rooms across the continent, old men in trench coats are shredding documents like confetti at a funeral. This is the end of the Cold War's outer empire, and the CIA and KGB They're watching their legacy burn in real time. It begins in Poland, where the Solidarity movement, nurtured through years of strikes, surveillance, and silent prayer, wins semi-free elections. The communists, stunned by actual democracy, step aside. No tanks, no purges, just stunned resignation. And somewhere in Langley, a CIA officer quietly exhales, one domino down, this time in reverse. Hungary follows next, cutting barbed wire at its border with Austria. East Germans start pouring through, and suddenly East Berlin isn't a prison, it's a hallway. People walk across the border like it's a Sunday stroll. On November 9th, a confused East German spokesman mutters something about immediate travel. The wall opens, Berliners swarm. They don't shout slogans, they dance. The CIA didn't predict this, not because they weren't watching, but because it happened faster than logic allowed. Intelligence officers scrambled to explain a world shifting under their feet. They'd spent decades preparing for a war that might never come. Now they were watching a revolution they hadn't planned, one driven not by guns, but by bored citizens and faulty economic spreadsheets. Historians still argue whether the CIA helped trigger the fall or just cheered from the sidelines. Sure, they'd smuggled printing presses, supported dissidents, whispered to reformers, but the truth, these regimes fell because they were hollow, because people were done pretending, because the lie had gotten too heavy to carry. Meanwhile, the KGB flailed. Their East European satellites were slipping away, and their hands were tied. They couldn't send tanks without Moscow's blessing, and Gorbachev, ever the reformer, wouldn't give it. The Brezhnev Doctrine, once a license for intervention, was quietly buried in a shallow bureaucratic grave. One by one, the dominoes fell. Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Romania, some with grace, some with bullets. In Romania, Ceausescu tried to hold on. He gave speeches, he ordered crackdowns, he ran, and then he was executed by his own army on Christmas Day. It was messy, televised, and very final. And you, flipping through satellite photos in a CIA archive, notice something surreal. Checkpoints abandoned, soldiers waving protesters through, graffiti blossoming like wildflowers on old walls. The empire of fear was dying, not with a bang, but with resignation. There's a fringe tidbit few remember. In East Germany, as the Stasi crumbled, citizens rushed to their headquarters and seized files before they could be destroyed. Entire neighborhoods worked in shifts, preserving evidence of decades of spying. Imagine discovering your neighbor informed on you, your lover, your child's teacher. It wasn't just a political collapse, it was emotional erosion. The CIA tried to capitalize, of course. New contacts, old adversaries turned assets. But mostly, they watched. The KGB, meanwhile, began to mutate, quietly transforming into something new. Fewer party lines, more oligarchs, less dogma, more capitalism, with surveillance. And beneath all of this a creeping question. If the Cold War ends, what do we become? Because espionage thrives on conflict. It needs walls, borders, secrets. Peace is terrifying when your whole career is built on whispers. You, sitting in the flickering light of a safe house once used for resistance meetings, understand something strange. This isn't victory, it's displacement. For both sides, the world didn't suddenly become safer. It became unmoored. And out there, behind the smiles and reunifications, something darker is stirring. Because just when one empire falls, another begins to reinvent itself. You're in Moscow, 1991, watching the storm arrive, not with missiles or tanks, but with microphones and press conferences. The Soviet Union, after nearly 70 years of icy defiance, is melting, not from outside pressure, but from rot within. And for once, the CIA doesn't need spies to get the intel. It's all happening live on television. Mikhail Gorbachev is on vacation in Crimea when the hardliners strike. A group of Soviet officials, calling themselves the State Committee on the State of Emergency, attempts a coup. They roll tanks into Moscow, shut down TV stations, and place Gorbachev under house arrest. The world holds its breath. But then, something unexpected happens. People flood the streets. Civilians surround tanks. Protesters climb armored vehicles waving Russian flags. Boris Yeltsin, still technically a nobody with a presidential title, climbs atop a tank and denounces the coup in front of the Russian parliament. His voice shakes, his hand doesn't, and just like that, the coup collapses under the weight of its own cowardice. The KGB, once the feared hammer of Soviet repression, is caught off guard. Some of its leaders supported the coup, others stayed silent. Either way, their myth of omnipotence dies in that moment. One CIA officer later called it the day the shadows blinked. Historians still argue how much the CIA knew beforehand. Some say they were blindsided, relying too much on formal channels and not enough on instinct. Others suggest they knew something was coming, but underestimated the inertia of reform. Either way, by the time the dust settles, the Cold War isn't just over. The entire Soviet system has unraveled. What follows is chaos, wrapped in ceremony. Gorbachev returns to Moscow, weakened and exhausted. On December 25th, he resigns on live television. The red Soviet flag comes down from the Kremlin. In its place, the tricolour of the Russian Federation. You can almost hear the KGB filing cabinets slamming shut across the country. And then, almost immediately, the game changes. Because the question isn't what happens when the Cold War ends, but what rises from its ashes. The CIA scrambles to reposition. Overnight, a world of us versus them turns into something far messier. Russia is no longer the enemy, at least not officially. Former Soviet republics declare independence. Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus, each a new intelligence challenge, new governments, new loyalties, new spies. The chessboard didn't vanish, it multiplied. And the KGB, well, it's gone in name, but only in name. The Committee for State Security dissolves. Its assets, its archives, and many of its personnel are absorbed into the new Russian Federation. Out of the ashes rises the FSK, later renamed the FSB. Different acronym, same instincts. Surveillance doesn't retire, it just gets better lighting. One fringe detail that feels too poetic to be accidental. In the final days of the USSR, a mysterious briefcase containing classified Soviet files was reportedly auctioned off by a rogue intelligence officer for cash, not loyalty. What was inside? Nuclear protocols, spy lists, old cafeteria menus. No one knows, but the fact that it happened speaks volumes. The empire didn't just collapse, it liquidated. You, watching the news from a drab CIA office, feel something unexpected, unease. This was supposed to be the end of the story. But endings are tidy. This is entropy. Files scattered, loyalties shifting, 1,000 new players stepping into the vacuum once held by two giants. And back in Moscow, a young former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin watches silently from the wings, learning, remembering, waiting, because the Cold War is over. But the cold, it lingers. You're in the shadows of a Moscow winter. Snowflakes fall like silent dossiers, each one a memory of a former empire. And in the distance, quietly and without fanfare, a man steps into power, his name Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, former KGB lieutenant colonel, briefly head of the FSB, now acting president of Russia. The Cold War is over, but if you listen closely, you'll hear the old machinery warming up again. Putin doesn't come with a dramatic flourish. He doesn't wave red flags or chant old slogans. He doesn't need to. He speaks softly, efficiently, with the kind of confidence that doesn't need applause. And within months, he's reactivating old networks, consolidating control, and sending a very clear message: the Cold War may be dead, but its bones are still useful. Inside the FSB, the rebranded KGB, the mood shifts from panic to purpose. Files are dusted off, contacts re-established. Old rivalries with Western intelligence agencies begin to simmer again, this time without the ideological theatre. It's not about communism anymore, it's about power. The CIA, caught flat-footed, initially hopes for reform. Some even believe Putin might modernize Russia, work with the West, become a partner in global stability. That illusion dies quickly, right around the time journalists start falling out of windows and oligarchs begin vanishing on luxury vacations. And in the shadows of this new millennium, the espionage games resume, this time with new tools. Cyber warfare becomes the new frontier. Russian hackers, often state-sponsored or state-tolerated, begin probing Western systems, power grids, banks, election systems. They move with eerie precision, leaving behind Cyrillic breadcrumbs and digital graffiti like calling cards. Historians still debate the extent of Putin's direct involvement in early cyber ops, but few doubt the strategy: disinformation, social manipulation, digital blackmail. It's the new KGB toolkit, cleaner and harder to trace. The CIA adapts, of course. They expand cyber divisions, hire hackers with criminal records and government suits, and launch counter-ops. The new battlefield isn't Berlin, it's a laptop. And the new agents? Coders in hoodies, fluent in Python, and plausible deniability. But the psychological warfare remains the same. Russia, through the FSB, GRU, and a web of unofficial patriotic hackers, begins to target not just systems, but stories. They manipulate news, amplify divisions, and sow chaos in Western democracies. It's Cold War 2.0, except now the battlefield is your Facebook feed. One quirky but real detail. During the early 2000s, several Russian operatives were caught using old-school spycraft, dead drops in parks, invisible ink messages, even hollowed-out rocks with USB sticks. It was like watching a Bond movie crash into a cyberpunk novel. Tradition meets innovation, betrayal gets Wi-Fi, and you, somewhere in Langley, reading an intercepted email chain laced with Russian slang and memes, realize that the game never stopped. It just evolved. Meanwhile, back in Moscow, Putin continues his consolidation. The intelligence services are no longer tools. They are the spine of the state. Former FSB men become governors, ministers, CEOs. It's an old Soviet joke made real. The KGB didn't die, it just rebranded and took over the country. The West watches nervously, unsure whether to engage, contain, or pretend nothing's happening. Some politicians call for sanctions, others for diplomacy. Meanwhile, the spy games intensify beneath the surface. And through it all, Putin plays the long game. Patient, calculated, smiling only when necessary. Because in his world, the Cold War never really ended. It just paused to reload. And now, the pieces are back on the board. And far away, in a secure CIA meeting room, someone circles a name on a file labeled High Priority. Not a code name, not a pseudonym, just Vladimir Putin. You're in a sterile conference room somewhere in Washington, the kind where even the water tastes classified. A projector hums softly, the lights dim, and on screen, photos of nondescript men walking dogs in London parks, sipping espresso in Vienna, or carrying suspiciously heavy backpacks in Berlin. The briefing is on active measures, except now they're not Cold War relics, they're global headlines. Welcome to the era of post-Cold War espionage, where everything old is new again, and subtler, and somehow louder. Active measures, those Soviet-era techniques for influencing, disrupting, and destabilizing, never went away. They just traded mimeographs for memes. In the early 21st century, Russia's intelligence services, particularly the GRU and FSB, took what they'd learned during the Cold War and adapted it for a new world, a noisier, faster, and infinitely more connected one. Assassinations still in play. Ask Alexander Litvinenko, a former FSB agent poisoned in 2006 with radioactive polonium-210 in London, a murder so theatrical it felt like a Bond villain overachieving. And the message was clear: betrayal has consequences, no matter where you run. In 2018, another high-profile poisoning shook the UK, this time in Salisbury, where former Russian double agent Sergei Skripal and his daughter were attacked with a nerve agent called Novichok. The suspects, two Russian nationals, with suspiciously vague cover stories and bad excuses about church visits. British intelligence traced the operation to the GRU, and the global backlash was swift. Russia, naturally, denied everything with its usual cocktail of denial, deflection, and YouTube links. Historians and spy masters still argue, why so public, why so risky? The answer lies in modern strategy. These weren't just hits, they were signals, psyops, theatre, proof that Moscow's reach was long and its patience shorter. Meanwhile, the CIA wasn't exactly idle. After 9/11, much of its focus shifted to counter-terrorism, drone strikes, and Middle Eastern intelligence. But as Russia reasserted itself, the old Cold War instincts kicked back in. New recruits were taught not just Arabic and Pashto, but Russian again. Assets were reactivated, listening stations tuned to Moscow frequencies. But the game had changed. Now disinformation spread faster than any bugged phone call. Social media became a battlefield where fake accounts, troll farms, and algorithmic chaos could sow discord more effectively than any suitcase bomb. In 2016, the world watched as Russian operatives used Facebook, Twitter, and email leaks to disrupt the US presidential election. They didn't need to change votes, they just needed to stir the pot, divide, distract, disorient. One fringe detail that's painfully real: Russian operatives organized opposing protests in American cities on the same day, in the same location. They even supplied signs to both sides. It wasn't just about picking a side, it was about making sure no one trusted any side. You, reading through digital forensics reports and intercepted Slack messages, begin to understand something chilling. The new espionage isn't about stealing secrets, it's about making truth optional. And yet, beneath the digital fog, some things never change. Spies still meet in parks. Dead drops still exist. Intelligence officers still wake up, wondering if today's mole will be their undoing. The CIA and FSB still play chess. Only now, some of the pieces are AI-generated. One particularly surreal case involved a Russian agent in Vienna using an online dating app to meet diplomats and subtly extract information. The CIA dubbed the method Tinderformant. Cute, creepy, classic. And here's the rub: in a world overflowing with information, it's harder than ever to know what matters. That's the new espionage. Not silence, but saturation. You, leaving the briefing room, feel it. The Cold War's bones may lie in history's closet, but its breath still fogs the glass. Because this isn't a rematch. It's the sequel that never needed a green light. And the next act is already underway. You're sitting in a windowless room, lit by the dull glow of monitors, each screen flickering with faces, coordinates, and keywords. It's modern-day Langley, but it could be anywhere. Because in today's intelligence world, geography is fluid, memory is digital, and the Cold War, it's become a subscription model. The CIA and the FSB no longer operate in a world of clear lines. Their battleground isn't Berlin or Havana, it's everywhere. A flash drive in a Tokyo hotel, a compromised Wi-Fi network in Warsaw, an encrypted chat between two video gamers in Sao Paulo that turns out to be a covert message between handlers. And yet the old Cold War DNA is still in the bloodstream. Russia, under Putin's increasingly paranoid gaze, has refashioned itself into a state where intelligence isn't just a tool, it's a worldview. From the Siloviki, The ex-KGB men, now running everything from oil to elections to hybrid warfare in Ukraine. It's clear that the KGB didn't vanish. It just switched to night mode. Ukraine, in particular, became the Cold War's spiritual sequel. Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea sent shockwaves through intelligence circles. The GRU's involvement in the Donbas conflict, cyber attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, and disinformation campaigns across Europe signaled a very old ambition wrapped in very new tactics. Historians still argue whether Putin's moves are strategic or survivalist. Is he playing chess or just flipping the board? Some say he's reviving empire, others that he's simply cornered, weaponizing nostalgia. Either way, intelligence services on both sides know the game has changed, but not the stakes. The CIA, for its part, now fights on multiple fronts. Human intelligence still matters. Moles, defectors, assets, but now algorithms matter too. Predictive models, metadata, analysis, open source intel, OSINT. Sometimes the best secrets aren't stolen, they're public, just buried under a billion cat videos. But don't let the buzzwords fool you. At its core, espionage remains human. It's still a whispered name in a crowded bar, a flash of a camera in a parking lot, a janitor who notices something off, and a handler who still buys bad coffee in paper cups while passing envelopes too thin to be innocent. And the drama continues. Take the SolarWinds hack of 2020, one of the most sophisticated cyber espionage operations in recent history. Attributed to Russian state actors, it breached US government agencies and private companies, siphoning data for months. The scope was staggering. The stealth? Even more so. When the breach was discovered, it was like waking up and realizing someone had been living in your house, silently rearranging the furniture. One fringe detail, the code used in the attack included subtle jokes, references only Russian-speaking developers would recognize. A quiet signature, a smirk in binary. In response, the CIA ramped up offensive cyber capabilities, but also re-embraced the analog cultivating sources, reactivating networks, teaching a new generation of officers that sometimes the best way to gather intel is to simply listen. Meanwhile, Moscow accuses the West of hypocrisy, pointing to their own claims of CIA interference. Protests in Belarus, CIA-backed, they say. Navalny's poisonings, Western fabrications. Every accusation a smokescreen, every smokescreen a signal. You, sifting through the noise, start to see the pattern. Espionage today isn't about secrets, it's about narratives. It's about who controls the story and whose version becomes truth. And that story, it's still being written in invisible ink, because the Cold War didn't end. It just learned how to tweet. You're in a library that smells like dust and regret. On the table, a pile of declassified documents, ink faded but still sharp enough to sting. A CIA memo here, a KGB transcript there. Between them, a Cold War's worth of secrets pretending to be forgotten. And as you flip through them, one thing becomes painfully clear. Nothing about this war was truly cold. Because for all its silence, it left echoes. For all its shadows, it cast scars. By the early 2020s, the Cold War is long over, at least officially. But its architecture, the paranoia, the proxies, the posturing, still shapes the world. Countries still spy, agencies still lie, and truth, as always, is just another battlefield. You look at the numbers. The CIA's budget has ballooned. The FSB's reach has deepened. Surveillance technologies, once the stuff of science fiction, are now standard issue. Facial recognition, biometric databases, artificial intelligence, trained not to imagine, but to predict. But even with all this tech, the core of espionage hasn't changed. It's still about leverage, about knowing something your adversary doesn't, and pretending you don't know it. It's about secrets, not the big, flashy ones, the quiet ones, the ones that can ruin reputations, unravel alliances, collapse empires from the inside. The Cold War was supposed to be about ideologies, freedom versus communism, democracy versus dictatorship. But in hindsight, it was often about control, information, influence, identity. That's the legacy the CIA and KGB and their many offspring have left us. And that legacy doesn't rest easy. Take modern whistleblowers. Snowden, reality winner. People caught between loyalty and conscience, trapped in a game that no longer respects borders or ethics. Some call them traitors, others heroes. But the truth, they're symptoms of a larger tension, a world still addicted to secrecy, still haunted by the ghosts of 20th century intelligence. One poetic irony, many Cold War spies died in obscurity, their files redacted, their stories incomplete, and now historians try to stitch together lives from scraps of tape and whispers in congressional hearings. Some missions failed spectacularly. Others succeeded so quietly we'll never know they happened. The balance? A murky fog where justice is optional and memory is strategic. Even stranger, in today's geopolitical landscape, former enemies share intel when it suits them. The CIA and Russia have occasionally passed information on terrorism, on nuclear security, allies when it's convenient, rivals by default. It's not peace, it's Détente 2.0, a ceasefire without trust. And yet, something else is happening. A new generation of intelligence officers is growing up without Cold War baggage. They study the Berlin Wall in textbooks, not briefings. They speak of transparency, ethics, digital diplomacy. It's possible, just barely, that the future of espionage could evolve beyond the cycle of deception. But you know better, because you've read the files, you've walked the tunnels, you've tasted the paranoia. And while the players may change, the game never really ends. The Cold War didn't die, it adapted. It became folklore, strategy, myth, and somewhere, right now, a young analyst is logging into a secure network, opening a folder labeled Eyes Only, and reading about a plan so risky, so beautifully reckless, it could only exist in the shadow of history. You close the last file, but the silence, it still feels classified. So now, as the final whispers of the Cold War drift into sleep, you settle into the quiet. The names, Langley, Lubyanka, Berlin, Havana, fade into the hush of memory. The wires have gone silent, the briefcase is closed, and the shadows just for now have stepped back into the dark. You've journeyed through decades of secrets, sabotage, and suspicion, through tunnels beneath walls, bugs behind paintings, lies told in 7 languages and decoded in caffeine-fueled basements. You've walked beside agents who never existed and generals who changed the world with a pen stroke or a handshake or a look too long in the wrong direction. It's strange, isn't it, how so much of the Cold War, so much power, so much fear, was hidden in silence, in pauses between words, in the space between what people said and what they meant. And now that space is still here, waiting. But tonight you don't need to decode it. You've done enough. You've seen the shadows. You've listened to the ghosts. And now it's time to rest. So close your eyes. Let the faint hum of a forgotten wiretap drift into static, and sleep beneath the quiet weight of a world that somehow kept going.